Just waiting for it to start, and then we'll just begin the conversation. Okay, we are live. Okay, so we are live, everybody. All right, so I believe we can just begin the discussion. All right, let's. All right. Okay, so before we begin, I just want to give a quick introduction as people are trickling in as to why we're having this conversation. So to begin, and I have the faces up to the side on the left, so if I look like I'm not looking at you all, just forgive me. But to begin, America has become extremely divided following the murder of George Floyd, and a history of racism stemming from hundreds of years has been coming to the forefront of conversation in this country. And so multiple people over the past few weeks have unfortunately passed away: George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, to name a few. And they've started discussions in a lot of communities, not just the America as a whole, but even our smaller, if we're talking about Eritrean and Muslim communities, they've started a lot of conversations. So now we as a community of African immigrants, of Muslim immigrants, by association, we find ourselves involved in the tensions as they come to the forefront of conversation in this country. So we put together this panel to have a discussion around three main questions. The first one being, what form has racism developed in 2020 America? How has the African American community, and by extension, our Eritrean and Muslim communities experience these injustices, and what avenues are available to bring about change to these problems? So, alhamdulillah, we've been able to put together a panel of people from our own community specifically today, ranging with work from academia and politics to activism. So without further ado, I want to give everybody a chance to introduce themselves and tell us where they're from, tell us what they do, and just give us a very brief background on themselves. So we're going to start, and I will allow. I'm just going to open the floor up. So we could start with Kothar, if you wanted to begin.
Hi, assalamu alaikum everybody. My name is Kothar. A lot of y'all probably know me as Zizi. I'm from the Atlanta community, but I've been living in DC for about 5 years now. And I'm a master's candidate studying international affairs at Georgetown. Yeah, I'm just excited to be part of this conversation.
Thank you. And let's move it on to Maher, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum everybody. My name is Maher Absalam. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota, attorney that focuses on finance, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. I feel like it's very needed and timely, so looking forward to it.
Awesome. Okay, Sabri, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi and salam everyone. My name is Sabri. I was born and raised here in Arizona and went to Arizona State for undergrad. And I'm now in my third and last year at Harvard Law School. And I agree with what everybody else has said. I'm excited to be here for this conversation. I think it's really timely because of everything we have going on, and looking forward to it. Thank you.
Awesome. And then Adam, if you could introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, my name is Adam Singhal. I am originally from Houston, and I currently work in New York with a group called the Grassroots Law Project, organizing around the country to help people change their local systems of policing and the criminal legal system.
That's awesome. And then just to give background on myself, I'm a part of the Eritrean Muslims Council. I'm a chairman of the EMC, Akram Brahanu from Houston, Texas. So I'm excited to hear this conversation as well. I feel it's very timely, and this group of people are people that not only myself, but a lot of people in our community have learned a lot from. So we're excited to hear their 2 cents. So to begin, we're going to start on the conversation of racism in America and having a brief conversation on the history of modern day racism in America. And so to begin, I want to start with a question for Kother. I understand you have you've taken classes and have developed a big understanding of the conversation around the public school to prison pipeline. So I just wanted to ask you if you can dive into that and give us some understanding of what that means.
Yeah, sure. So I think before getting into the school to prison pipeline, when understanding the fact that the majority of schools are funded by local property taxes, it's really important to also look at housing discrimination. I'm just going to touch upon that real quick. Basically, you know, in this country, we know that the main method to accumulate wealth is around home ownership. And whether or not that's like ethical can be contested. But it's been systematically made impossible to do that for Black people in this country through policies like redlining, where maps were kind of drawn strategically to have less desirable parts of, you know, cities and towns to be relegated to Black people, and then those areas were underfunded. When you have things like white flight, where lower income Black people, brown people will move into communities and white people will leave, and that kind of being tied to property value then going down, even when Black people are able to purchase property. You have things like gentrification, which also makes it very difficult for Black people to maintain a space for political power, for economic power, and kind of having to constantly restart. So yeah, that's kind of, when thinking about the sort of like the white picket fence American dream, I think that's really important to backdrop before talking about school to prison pipeline. So as underfunded schools make neighborhoods kind of less appealing, and home prices are going to decrease, and then you have less funding for schools, kind of in that cyclical way. When you look at the ways that we create schools, public schools, which are supposed to be the kind of equalizing factor in our country, you'll see that the criminalization of young students in Black schools is very prevalent, and it kind of already pushes them towards the already flawed criminal justice system, right? So Black students are more likely to be suspended, Black students are more likely to be arrested than their white counterparts at very alarming rates. And so I think it's really critical when we're presented with that information, we see the statistics, for thinking about like why that is the case. Like, are Black children, are Black students just inherently more more likely to misbehave? Are they just, you know, scoring poorly because they're less intelligent? And I think that when you're confronting that information, you can kind of break it down to three things. So one of those things is, like we just mentioned, with resources. Inadequate funding can look like not having as much money, but it can also look like budget allocation going towards having police officers in schools rather than having counselors and social workers and nurses to help students that are struggling, right? It can look like implicit bias. So we know that all of us are impacted by volumes of information that teaches us that, you know, Black people are just lesser than in so many ways, right? So that's obviously going to manifest itself in all parts of our society, including the classroom. And you'll see when you look at also the numbers of teachers that are Black, that it's very rare for Black students to even be having Black teachers, Black administrators, and things like that. And of course, Black people are as well. We also internalize those biases, but I think that's also an important thing to highlight. Let's see what else. I think also talking about how we adopt a punitive model when engaging with issues when students are struggling, rather than, you know, looking at why the student might be acting out. Like, maybe this person just has a lot of energy, we can put them in sports or something like that, or oh, maybe this child is struggling with something at home, or maybe this child might be having issues with like a certain like learning disability or something like that in the classroom, which is why they're struggling. jumping to expel them or suspend them, having like zero tolerance policies, having police presence on campuses, having cameras. It's kind of already pushing towards a certain direction, right? And so, you have to think, okay, if there's a student that's struggling, does it make sense to send them to expel them or suspend them, right? And when we see like the recidivism rates of young people that enter the criminal justice system at a young age, we know that they're way more likely statistically to continue to have infractions with the system. And on that theme of like punitive models of punishment, I just want to touch upon also the way that we see this manifesting on a larger level, right? Like outside of the classroom. So we see like the war on drugs as kind of the example that we talk about a lot, right? Like we saw the significant difference in approach when addressing the usage of crack cocaine in the 80s, where you had Black people, Black communities being vilified as being more criminal-like, immoral for the usage of crack, but then seeing that cocaine was being used also in more affluent white communities. And you also saw the sentencing to very greatly differ as well in that regard, and also then seeing the policing of those communities to differ very greatly. So, understanding that we're going to have social problems, right? But there's different approaches to addressing them when that happens. So, thinking about a person that's struggling with drug addiction, is sending them to prison going to help them, deal with that addiction? Is, like in terms of like the addiction piece, but then also like what is driving them to use these substances? Is it economic insecurity? Is it like other social issues that they're dealing with, right? And I think in a more like present tense, we see this conversation also happening with the opioid crisis. So because opioids are being used in white communities, we've adopted a public health response to it, right? Rather than a punitive response. So I think that draws a lot of themes that we see happening in other conversations in our country related to criminal justice.
Thank you. No, it's a very broad topic, but there's so many different things that play into it, and just having that understanding really helps bring it into focus. So thank you for the response. And moving to the next section of the conversation of racism in America as it's developed in modern day America, there's this conversation of why hasn't change happened yet, which leads us to topics that people might hear of, things like red line and housing, and how that affects the ability for people to bring change through voting. So I wanted to point this question towards Adam Ali. How is change affected when people are suppressed from voting, or is there more to it? Just give us your thoughts.
Yeah, so voting is just one of many ways that we can create change in society, but it is an essential and very effective one. And historically, that right has been diminished since the end of Reconstruction. We know obvious cases in the past of voting tests and literacy tests, which were ruled unconstitutional. The Voting Rights Act was supposed to expand that right, and has also been diminished in recent years in cases that have kind of pulled back restrictions on a lot of southern states in particular on how they administer voting laws. Voter ID laws are also a huge barrier and impediment, purposely and very intentionally racist laws that are meant to disenfranchise poor people and Black people and brown people. And we see, even in the most recent elections that we've had, very, very obvious voter suppression. So the most recent case is that in the city of Louisville, which has 600,000 people, they had one voting location in a really important Senate race between a really corporate Democrat and a Black progressive Democrat. So it's hard not to point out the very intentional efforts to make it harder and harder for people to vote. And I'd also caution that like there's a coming fight about voter suppression around mail-in voting. You see now like the messaging on the right is that mail-in voting is not safe, which is just patently false. And it's intended to decrease people's ability to participate in elections. But there's another element of voter suppression that I don't think gets enough conversation, which is actually talking to voters. I think a lot of people don't vote because they aren't being listened to, and because politicians don't seem to actually take an interest in changing systemically flawed programs that we have enacted. So I think a large part of the way that we can help address voter suppression is by having people in power who are actually listening and addressing the concerns of the vast majority of people. But to start to actually push for that, the first step that we have to be taking is trying to organize around elections, trying to get out and vote and show that we are an important voting bloc that can really sway the way that elections and outcomes in elections occur.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very big point. So looking at other ways that systemic inequality have kind of grown, let me point a question to Maher and asking. We've talked a lot about housing and we've talked a lot about voting, but housing kind of stems around the conversation of finance and the ability to afford a house. So in the field of finance and what you deal with, how important is capital to being able to grow as not only a community, but even just an individual?
Yeah, I mean, capital is very important, right? So you can have a wonderful idea, you can be willing to go to school and do a lot of things, but capital could be a very, very hard limit and restriction to your life. And so I think if you look in every kind of area of life or kind of sphere of life, you'll seldom do you see racism not there. Starting from, I think we talked about the school to prison pipeline, and that kind of continues, or that kind of discrimination kind of continues when you go to undergrad or higher education, and you see that you're kind of paying more for school, paying a higher interest rate, and then you leave school with a higher debt. We have lower graduation rates, and so almost at every turn, we're almost positioned to do poorly. And then that kind of continues into the work-life balance. And so once you start working, you're earning something like 74 cents to the white man's dollar. And that kind of continues on and so forth. We have the lower home ownership rates, and folks that start businesses are typically ones that can pull on their home equity loans. And so it kind of, it's almost like a birth to cradle kind of discrimination or inequality that lasts a lifetime, because what happens then is, Black and brown people kind of get old and raise these children and never really are able to take those chains off. That kind of makes sense. You got school and mortgage debt that's unreasonable compared to the mainstream white population. And then with the ending factor is that the next generation has less to start out with, less inheritances. And then that cycle just kind of continues. And so, I mean, it really goes in every kind of sphere of our lives. A couple that I haven't mentioned is, discrimination at the workplace. Black women particularly are kind of hit the hardest here, earning much less than everybody else and being treated less fairly than everybody else. So, I mean, it kind of, you can point to everything, buying insurance, buying cars, we're almost kind of set up to be taken advantage by the system. And sometimes, you'll see that Black and brown people are now within these systems and work within these banks, but it's more than that. The entire system kind of has to be dismantled and reformed, because if you look at the history of how these things were created, it was not created with us in mind, and more, I would even go as far as to say that it was kind of created to take advantage of minority folks. And sometimes I think Eritreans have a hard time looking at ourselves as the kind of the direct in a very bad way, beneficiaries of this discrimination. But I remember there was a study done, especially in Minneapolis, about a couple years ago that came to the conclusion that foreign-born Africans and native-born African Americans kind of go apart statistically after 10 years. And so it only takes a foreign-born African to come to the US and kind of hit the same type of lower metrics that African Americans see. And so it does affect us, I think, within the first generation. And so I think all these points that are being made are very relevant.
Oh, that's a very good point. Let me direct this question to begin to Sabri, but I just want to ask for Sabri, how does systemic inequality affect the legal system in the United States? And then off of that, what other categories, this is open for everybody on the panel, what other categories of life does it affect? But to begin, how does it affect the legal system, Sabri?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's no secret that Black people, minorities are severely hurt by the criminal justice and legal system more than any other races. A professor once told me that Black people and white kids, Black youth and white youth are going to use the same drugs, smoke the same weed, use the same cocaine or whatnot, but Black youth are going to go to jail 6 times more likely as white youth. African Americans make up 13% of the US population, yet 40% of our prison population is African Americans. 1 out of every 3 Black male youth in their lives can expect to go to prison or serve a sentence at some point. And because of that, not only is going to prison the problem, but once they leave, they don't have the access to education, to resources, to any kind of capital to rebuild their lives. And I think the legal and criminal justice system is just one of the many ways where this racism is perpetuated. And on the subject of resources, another startling statistic is that the average Black family is going to hold 1 cent of wealth to every dollar. The average Black family is going to hold 1 cent of wealth to every dollar that the average white family holds. This lack to resources and finance and capital is hindering African Americans from getting the access to the same education, to the same healthcare, and to the same representation within the legal system specifically.
Wow. So just an open question, and don't feel obligated because you guys have covered so much already, but are there any other categories that maybe we haven't missed that are affected as well? And if not, don't feel obligated to answer that.
I know in healthcare, there are also huge disparities. First one that comes to mind is maternal health, where Black women are significantly more likely to die in childbirth, largely because doctors don't listen to them when they say that they are in pain or that something is wrong. So that is just one of many health disparities that exist. There's also environmental health disparities, environmental racism, and the fact that Black communities are often the places where you have huge trucking businesses and you have huge plants that are constantly polluting, and people complain about those things and nobody listens and actually gets anything done to fix it, in part because it was designed to be next to those Black communities.
Yeah, touching upon the theme of health, I think definitely echoing everything you're saying about Black maternal health being a big concern, both when women are in childbirth, but also prenatal care. And I think in that same way, we see it right now kind of being exacerbated by the coronavirus epidemic, and seeing how Black people in particular, also, brown communities as well, are disproportionately being impacted by the virus because of pre-existing health conditions, many of which they didn't know about before because of our healthcare system, because of the fact that they're working essential worker jobs that they're not getting paid like they're essential workers for. And so there's those issues as well. And when you see the underlying health conditions that a lot of Black people have, and how they're related to not having adequate healthcare resources for years in the making, living in areas that are food deserts, not having those sort of resources for years. When you're trying to tackle the issue of someone getting sick or someone having a baby, you're dealing with that moment, but also years of systemic racism kind of happening. So I like echoing what you're saying. I think healthcare is one of those spaces, particularly for a community that talks about medicine and being doctors so much. I think it's one that it's a very interesting opportunity to kind of see this manifest in.
That's a great point. That last, particularly in our community, if a lot of people talk about being doctors, it's very, very relevant. So, alhamdulillah, just discussing that that topic of like modern day racism and how it has kind of come to be, it kind of gives us light to the next section of the conversation, which is how do these experiences play out in everyday life? So I know Sabri specifically. You had a specific situation go happen. So you're, just to give a little bit of context before we start, you're in the, is it Harvard Law, correct? So you guys took a photo and something happened. I just want to give you the opportunity to enlighten us as to the experience that racism in America plays in even our day-to-day lives. So Sabri.
Yeah. So about a year ago, spring 2019, my fellow Black classmates in my year, both male and females, we decided to take a picture of all of us to display to Black youth and minorities in this country that you can make it to schools, institutions such as this. I think a large problem in the minority community is that we're taught, or we feel that we can't make it to good schools, we can't make it to good jobs, we can't make it to high places of education, and so forth. So so anyways, we took this picture, we put it on the internet, went viral, went through different social media platforms and whatnot, and eventually it ended up on LinkedIn. And some white male individual on LinkedIn commented on the photo that we look like gang members. I didn't even know you could be racist on LinkedIn. I didn't realize that could be a thing. But regardless, he did comment that we look like gang members, and it was particularly hurtful because again, these are people who hold positions of power not only at schools but in jobs and whatnot, and they're disseminating rhetoric that people who are Black at these schools still look like gang members, and it's just again showing sending the wrong message to youth in our country that even if you make it to places of higher learning or whatnot, you're still going to be viewed as someone who's a threat, who's a danger and whatnot, And look, I'm proud to be a part of that gang. I think that gang is doing pretty well. But at the same time, it just further displays racism across this country. And I think we also posted that picture to show that, to celebrate ourselves, I think a lot of times, minorities in this country face imposter syndrome and have this feeling or belief in the back of their heads that I'm only here because of affirmative action. I'm only here because they need a quota fill and whatnot. And that's not the case. In reality, you deserve to be there more than your white classmates and counterparts because you have to work harder. You didn't have the same resources or the same level of education that they did. So, it was tough seeing that, but you just got to brush it off and keep on trudging along.
That's amazing. That's an amazing reminder there at the end. So keeping with the topic of the experience of racism in America, Maher, I know you are originally from Minnesota, and these, I guess you could say the George Floyd protests kicked off from Minnesota. So what were your experiences, whether it be from before it and what helped set it off as a catalyst, and then actually being there as it occurred? So what were the experiences in Minnesota?
Yeah, I'm going to include one quick caveat and say that I'm not really an activist. I've just kind of been around the scene and joined these protests when they happen. But kind of my involvement since like 2013, 2014 has been through this organization called the African American Leadership Forum. And then kind of working through them, that was really my first time kind of getting a bird's eye view of all the different issues that are going on in Minneapolis. And the way they identified it was it's the new Jim Crow South. So if you think about the original Jim Crow South, you think about Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and so forth, Georgia. But now currently, if you look at the numbers and disparities between white folks and Black folks, financial, education, healthcare, in almost in every realm, you see that Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, maybe Illinois in there as well are the new South, where there's a huge disparity. And it can be kind of deceiving because we have a very passive aggressive Midwestern nice type of, especially Minnesota, there's a whole Minnesota nice culture. But underneath all that, there's for the lack of better terms, there's a rot of uh, opportunity, of I guess when not to get philosophical, but in my opinion, kind of the migration from the South up over the last 60 years has not been that successful, or at least not as successful as people kind of put it out. So in Minnesota, particularly, like Black folks are not doing that well. Graduation rates at the bottom. Financially, we are doing horrendous. I think net worth of a Black person, I'm just going to pull this out of the air, something between 4,000 to 6,000 net worth of a Black family, where the white counterparts are more in the 40s and 50,000. So you're talking almost a 10-time difference in financials, and that kind of magnifies and everything else. But in any event, in Minnesota, we have it was kind of known that we had all these different issues, and there was I'm not even going to say that it's Republicans or Democrats. It's kind of both, with the different kind of motivations kind of getting in the way of progress, at least in Minnesota. And then we had a couple of high-profile shootings. We had Jamar Clark, and then we had Philando Castile, which kind of shook, I think, white folks in Minnesota for the first time to the kind of underlying issues. But then nothing ever really happened. We've had Democratic governors that have done, tried to do a lot of good work, and it's always incremental change. They'll put a review panel, and then something will happen. Body footage was turned off. They will put a different AG or a different district attorney or whatever it might be, and sometimes those charges don't come through. So I think what we saw with George Floyd was almost an eruption of this is it, this is enough. We've had high-profile killings, we've had high-profile elections, and nothing is changing. And throughout this whole time, and just to be candid, I didn't take this too seriously throughout this whole time, but the last kind of 5 to 6 years, there's been this notion of abolishing the police. And, City Hall never kind of took that proposal seriously. But I think this time, just the number of people that showed up to these protests, the amount of money that was raised, and then just the sheer political pressure that everyone kind of felt in Minneapolis, that proposal kind of took up some steam. And now the city council has agreed to kind of abolish the police. The kind of the next steps or alternative plan for that have not kind of been laid out, but just kind of acknowledging that need has been a pretty big achievement. And shout out to Minneapolis for spurring a lot of those protests. So it means something now, right? So.
Yeah, for sure. So that's there was a whole backstory to it, and that's amazing to hear, especially from your perspective, having lived in it and grown up in the city, the stages of how it progressed. Sometimes it takes someone's eyes on the ground to truly understand what's going on. So I appreciate that explanation, Maher. So pivoting off that, still speaking on experiences of racism, how has the African American community and by extension our Eritrean, our Muslim communities, how have we experienced racism? So this is just going to be an open forum question for everybody. So whether it be racism in the Muslim community, and I could speak on that even, or just being Eritrean American, being Black, has there ever been a moment where you realized you were Black? So for me personally, I'm from Houston, but I spent 8 years in Western Canada, and I was the only Black kid in my class. There was 2 Black kids in my school that I can remember distinctly, and I always used to fight with the other one. But we ended up getting along well, because at the end of the day, you have to be friends with your brother. So is there an experience that made you realize as an Eritrean, you're Black? Or is there an experience where you dealt with racism in the Muslim community? So just feel free to open up on that, and I'll hop in with y'all as well. So I can give an example to start. Just growing up in the Houston community, and I've made a lot of friends and been able to connect with a lot of different people. I can distinctly remember growing up and going to Friday prayers every week, going to Jum'ah, and we would spend time making dua to specific people. And it was amazing because we'd make dua for other parts of the ummah. We would make dua for people that really needed it. Palestine and the ordeal they're going through. They deserve dua. And the Uyghur Muslims and what they're going through, and they deserve dua and they deserve prayers. And Rohingya and all these different groups. And it's amazing that we come together to make dua for them. But where the racism shines through for me is the silence to sub-Saharan Africa and Black Muslims. Because I can remember every week making dua for at least one other community, whether it be Pakistan. But the first time I ever heard a dua being made for a sub-Saharan African community was Sudan very recently. And I've been in Houston for over a decade. And that's the first time I heard it. So it shines through in the silence, this level of racism, and then it portrays out into other sections. So it's being able to comprehend that, come to terms with that, and then start working to fix that I personally see as something that we need to address. So if anybody wants to build off of that, either as an Eritrean, being Black in America, or dealing with it in the Muslim community.
Yeah, I can talk about a couple things. I think one, on an individual specific level, you know, I'm at the school I'm at right now. One classmate asked me if I would be upset if affirmative action was eradicated, because that would mean I wouldn't be able to get to where I am. This is, again, a law school classmate of mine asking, or would you be upset if affirmative action would be eradicated, because he thought it was only there because of that reason. Another classmate of mine asked me if I only like Obama because he's Black and I'm Black. And again, these are people who are going to be going off to be lawyers and be people who make decisions both in the political and the policy world, asking another Black person very offensive questions. And like Akram said, overall, you know, I grew up in Chandler, Arizona, not really a diverse place. So I was oftentimes the only Black person in my elementary school, middle school, high school classrooms. And you just face a lot of, you know, weird questions, a lot of discriminatory behaviors and whatnot that, you know, as a kid, you may not really register, but when you look back on and reflect on now, they do hurt. And I think the last thing I want to talk about is what Akram was talking about was, I think in the Muslim community and in the Eritrean community by extension, there's this idea or mentality that, you know, Black Americans' problems are not our problems, that it's Yom Tzadamti, and then we are our own thing and so forth. And I think that's a really flawed way of thinking. I think we're all the same. At the end of the day, we're Black. Like, you know, African Americans, well, Eritrea is in Africa too. It's the same continent, right? Just because their ancestors and whatnot might have came before ours, it does not make their problems and our problems any different, you know? And a lot of Muslims will often, you know, complain and be frustrated that no one hears them when there's Islamophobic rhetoric being spewed in society. But when injustices are facing, especially their Black Muslim brothers, they stay silent. So I think it's important for our generation, especially, to really understand how serious that mentality is, and it's indicative of an idea and a way of thinking that would not lead to any progress for our communities overall.
Definitely. Yes. So.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Someone else.
No, great.
Just real quick. And I don't mean to not fully delve in and do it justice, but I don't want to also take time from this question. When you asked earlier about other spaces where we see anti-Blackness manifesting or other intersections to consider, I think it's really important to think also about issues related to disability. That's an area that I really forget about. But, you know, even when thinking specifically about criminal justice reform issues, or criminal justice, I would say issues, because I don't know if I really believe in reform. I think it's really important to think about that, because Black people who have different, or people just in general that have different disabilities are significantly more likely to have dangerous and potentially lethal interactions with police officers. And I just feel like for myself and holding myself accountable, I know that that's an intersection that I don't think about as often as I think about, you know, class or gender and things like that. On the note of the question that you just asked, I think for sure that we see, you know, certain regions or certain countries being mentioned in dua, and that's kind of a space where, when making dua, we kind of clearly see what people that we see ourselves in community with, like who do we include when we think of like our ummah, our community, people that we hold close enough to pray for, right? But I also think there are definitely rare cases where I hear African countries being mentioned, but I think even more rarely do I hear like our Black brothers and sisters in the States who are literally living like with us in our communities being thought of in our da'at. So for example, with everything going on in Minnesota, I mean, we're not in Masajid right now, but in the conversations I heard a lot of kind of like Muslim leaders having, and if we were to be in the Masajid, I don't know if that would have been a space where I would hear the Imam saying like, let's make dua for all the people kind of protesting right now in the streets right now, trying to advance the issues related to this. So I think just thinking about, you know, the people in our communities, like as that is the Sunnah, people who are literally living with us and seeing them as kind of members of our community as well. And then, sorry, I'm kind of rambling, but you said also, somebody said something about, what was it? Let me just come back to me on this one. But there was a point that Sabri made that I thought was really interesting about, oh, I know I was gonna say. So basically, I think it's really important as well for us to, when thinking about how we are kind of becoming Black in the American context, the ways that, like Marha was mentioning earlier, we can also kind of be, or think at least that we are beneficiaries of the oppression of the African American community. And so I think, especially when thinking about the economic component, you know, like for a lot of Eritreans, you might be coming here as refugees, as political asylees, maybe just economic migrants, right? But you're kind of starting in at zero, whereas for a lot of African Americans, you're making up for generations that have been in the negatives because of all these systemic issues. And there's also so much that comes with the social oppression, political oppression of these communities. And so I think that there's also a lot to be said about entering and recognizing that you are going to be like racialized into this community, but also realizing that there's a sort of like humility that you should kind of approach that with in learning from those leaders in the community, and recognizing that there are kind of differences and privileges that we kind of hold as well in the way that we kind of enter. I don't know if that makes sense. I know I was all over, but hopefully something there stuck.
No, definitely, it definitely makes sense. Yeah, recognizing that. I heard a sheikh recently speaking about the fact that as a Muslim community, we have to start having conversations about like the Nation of Islam and how that kind of paved the way for the Muslim community today. And then they don't really say anything about it unless it has to do with Malcolm X. And then they kind of hold them, oh, look at Malcolm. But then they just forget all the other stuff that had to do with African American liberation and things along those lines. But to move on to the next section, thank you.
Can I say one more thing, Akram? Sorry, not to cut you off.
For sure.
Yeah, I came across a stat the other day, and I have to get it out there. But and this is back to economic discussion we're having earlier, not to detract from where you're going. Again, my apologies. But in the Boston area, the median net worth for the average African American family is $8. Sorry, for the average African American is $8. Yes, it's $8. While the average net worth for the average white person is $147,000. And for those of you who don't know, Boston portrayed itself as a very liberal city. Massachusetts is, a Democratic, blue voting liberal state. And not to get too political here or anything, but oftentimes people will say, well, Republicans and conservatives are the ones who perpetuate racial inequality. And while that is true to the highest degree, it exists in all sectors of society, no matter what your other people's political belief is and whatnot. And again, this just shows like how this economic chasm that exists between Black people and non-POC people is one of the driving factors for many of the racial issues we're seeing today.
Just one other really quick thing. On the note of immigrants coming here, Eritrean immigrants or whatever immigrants coming here for better economic opportunities, I think it's really important for us to kind of interrogate capitalism and like racialized capitalism in this country, especially when, we have, I think elders, or just, I think we can do it as well, seeing how sometimes our African American brothers and sisters are struggling, and recognizing that, in this country, first form of capital in this country were Black people, Black enslaved people, right? And the systems of oppression that have existed, whether they're convict leasing or the prison industrial complex, there have been so many ways where like we see reiterations of that. So I think it's really important as people that are coming here to also educate ourselves about that system as well, especially for like immigrants who come here, you know, trying to chase the American dream and that sort of thing.
Yeah, these are all amazing points. Let me see. Is there anything else anybody else had in mind to add? If not, we can move on to the next section, which deals with solutions. And there's been a lot of ideas lately that have been tabled, but because, and I'll say me too, like I'm a part of this, because you don't have as much of a knowledge of the solutions, some of the stuff might sound extreme, like get rid of the police. What does that have to do with anything? Abolish the police. So I wanted to start off by asking Adam, I know you have a lot of work you're doing with the grassroots law firm, but I didn't know a ton about it. So I just want to ask you, who are the groups that are facilitating change and what should we know about them? Adam.
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that change always starts from people up, not from the top down. So although there have been some good champions in positions of power, the real systemic changes that we need are coming from grassroots organizations and from people organizing on the ground, namely groups like Movement for Black Lives, and Sunrise Movement's also doing a lot on environmental justice. The Black Lives Matter movement broadly is a coalition of a lot of different organizations, local chapters of Black Lives Movement, local chapters of DSA, I think are leading the charge on a lot of the organizing on the ground around the changes that we need to see. But a little bit about how the changes are being facilitated, I think, particularly with the criminal legal system, it's largely at a very local level, which I think is important. It's district attorneys who have a lot of power. It's city councils who have a lot of power over a police department. It's sheriffs who have power over counties and jails. So we don't have to wait on the president to change. We don't have to wait on Congress to suddenly change their mind and actually take action. We can pressure our local government. As Maher mentioned, like Minneapolis is a prime example of that. You had to have protests continuously. You had to burn down a police precinct, but eventually the local government realized that people were putting their feet to the fire and they had to take some action. And the action they took was the necessary action of disbanding the police department. And that's action that can happen around the country. The group that I am working with is organizing to empower people with the tools that they need to implement those changes. So I currently lead trainings with volunteers around the country, educating them about policies for defunding the police and eventual abolition of the police, and equipping them with the tools that they need to organize and put pressure against local officials to fundamentally change the systems that exist.
Yeah, that's very insightful. That's a very important conversation to have, who these groups are and how they're bringing about change. But let me address this next question to Kother. So the question is, there are a lot of different calls for change. There are ideas like police reform, there are ideas like police abolition, and then a lot of stuff across the board. But what are the different calls for change and what should we know about them?
Yeah, I think the two main camps were kind of prison and police reform and then abolition. And I think for a lot of people who were mobilized and energized, not only because of the egregious murder of George Floyd, but also of Breonna Taylor, of like Oluwatoyin, of so many others, and then obviously like Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin and so many others before that. People were, like you were mentioning, really fed up and they were going to the streets, but they were looking for actionable steps, right? So when activists who have been doing this work for so long were saying, okay, we need to abolish the police, that seemed kind of too radical, too extreme. And I know like a few years ago, like what Maher was saying, I was also like that too. I thought, okay, abolish the police might be a bit much. Maybe we can just like really cut it down, but that seems a little too far even for me. But ultimately, you know, people really galvanized around and were circulating the 8 Can't Wait campaign initially. And I think there's been a lot of good calling in to folks of why that was not the best way to engage with these issues. And I think it was, you know, most clearly illustrated when you had leadership from various big cities across America showing, oh yeah, like we have 5 of the 8, or we have 6 of the 8. Like, oh, how is it that you have all of these things that are supposedly gonna, you know, be a huge stride towards solving our problems when you have like New York and Chicago and New Orleans and Atlanta still having really difficult issues around this topic, but supposedly they have so many of these things kind of implemented. And I think another issue that was really highlighted with the issues of the 8 Can't Wait campaign or other reform efforts was that they can further entrench the systems that currently exist by kind of I think most clearly in terms of funding. So when we're deciding we're going to have a whole bunch of implicit bias trainings, which many police departments have tried, like Minnesota is an example, Minneapolis is an example, but you know, body cameras, like Maher mentioned, you know, sometimes they just turn off, or sometimes there's body camera footage and police officers will still do what they do with impunity. So there's, I think, before people kind of write off abolition, I think it's important to understand that most abolitionists are not kind of expecting police and prisons to just completely disappear tomorrow, but that there's kind of seeing like the first step of like defunding the police and other action items that abolitionist scholars have kind of called for. And I think it's really important to try to at least, you know, read the work that they're putting out and understand before making a final conclusion. So, you know, leaders like Angela Davis, for example, come to mind. There was a really good Dream Defenders teach-in that was hosted. I can give you a link, Akram, because I know you're going to put together resources after this. But, you know, watching and listening to those folks, a lot of the people on that call were organizers in Ferguson as well. You know, reading like, I think Abolition 101 is Are Prisons Obsolete? I think that is really helpful because it's not like we go to school and, you know, learn like if we were going to abolish the police, what would it look like, right? Like it takes work to understand that, just like it takes work to understand anything. But yeah, I think we have to really look at the social problems we're facing now and ask ourselves, based on what we see today, are we seeing like murder or sexual assault or domestic violence or any of the crimes, even the most egregious crimes that we consider to be kind of, you know, super reprehensible? Like, are they happening less frequently? Are they, you know, not existing now with the current system that we have? So yeah, I would just say it's our responsibility to at least educate ourselves on the different scholarly opinions before. And scholarly, I don't just mean like people who are in the ivory tower, also like grassroots organizers that have been doing this work. But yeah, doing that first, I think, is really critical. It's our responsibility.
For sure, definitely. And I definitely, everybody here I've learned something from, not only today, but prior to today, and have been able to take some of the knowledge. I know a few of you all have recommended me books, so I've been able to take those and learn from them. And even if it's just someone in your community who offers you a book or a pamphlet or a website to read, just being educated, that's such a great point. So let me, now, Adam, did you have a point?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in also on the point about abolition. So one, the notion of defunding is like a road to abolition. but people think that defunding is a radical idea. Defunding happens every year. It just happens to education, it happens to healthcare, it happens to housing. Like budgets exist every year and they cut from those things. So the idea of defunding the police is defunding something that just isn't working and investing in the things that are working. We saw since the 1994 crime bill a significant reduction in violent crime, 26% in the 4 years immediately, or the 6 years immediately after. Of that 26% reduction, 25% of that was because of things not related to policing. It was because of investments in housing, because of economic investments. 1% could be attributed to actually investments in policing. So the money that we're spending on policing is just a waste, in addition to like the clearly harmful things that are happening in communities because of police. And another point about like why it's not a radical idea to dramatically defund the police, if not abolish them, is that 4% of the times that police are responding to calls, it's a violent crime. So that means that 96% of the time, they're responding to things that a social worker is far better trained to respond to. Someone who doesn't have a gun is far better trained to respond to. So there's no clear reason why we need police officers, because the issues that they are dealing with are not policing issues. They are social issues that we need to invest in.
Wow, it's a very good point. On that note of what we can do to change it, because we've spoken about like defunding the police, which that last point you made was very poignant. Those two between Kothar and Adam, that's it's very enlightening. But on the ground, as to someone who might not have the understanding of these issues, how do I get involved? So I understand this is going to be pointed towards Maher, this question. I understand when things were happening in Minnesota, you were able to set up some sort of project with a group of people to help reestablish the Black businesses that were being affected by the riots in Minnesota. So I just wanted to get your take on what motivated you to do it, and then what were the impacts of you coming together, and what actually was the project?
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'm going to answer the quick question that you kind of put up front of kind of what the solutions look like. I think for the long term, especially, I think we have to focus on changing the public mind. I think that includes our kind of community thinking, and then the broader just kind of public mind of just thinking of each other as the same. Racial inequality is something that we need to kind of look at taboo, almost put a shame behind any type of discriminatory type of practices. For example, the dua, example I think is a good one. We're not, you can't put a policy or a law that says, we have to be more equitable to everybody that's suffering when we make dua, but it's almost, we need to kind of train everybody and re-educate everybody to kind of have everyone in there, when you're thinking of who's hurting or who, whatever it is, that you kind of think of everyone as one of the community. So on a short-term kind of basis, when this whole George Floyd protest erupted, a lot of businesses were impacted. So just kind of following the bigger theme of racial discrimination in America, what that does to Black folks is kind of give us less room to operate, less space to kind of make mistakes, less resources to recover. And so one of the things that we kind of thought about was, you have buildings that have been broken into, looted, some buildings that were burned down. And most of the time, Black folks don't own some of these hard assets. Real estate for sure is one of the big ones. But another point was how to navigate through, through all these different systems. So taxes, especially, to layer on top of all this was Corona. So taxes, insurance, and then just how to, one, assess where you were, two, figure out where you want to go, and then how to get the right help and resources to implement that recovery. And so me and my partner, so based out of Minneapolis, have a law firm. We decided to just kind of open up our lines to just people that needed help. And then we also opened up a quick kind of forum to get as many volunteers as possible. And it went pretty well. We had, I think, over 100 volunteers that signed up for that. And then we had two kind of big, one Fortune 100 company that partnered up with us, and then another smaller marketing firm that kind of helped, bolster our capabilities. So by the end of it, we had something like, 200 volunteers from accountants, lawyers, IT consultants, analytics to kind of help, like I said, help businesses assess, figure out what the owner wanted to do, help implement, and kind of help them get to that finish line. So on the short term, we were able to kind of fill that need. I think it's pretty fun being at this age where, we all kind of went to school for, various reasons, but one of my reasons, and I think a lot of immigrant kids, is to kind of give back to the community, or whatever kind of kid kind of going through school, is to kind of always give back to the community. And I think this was the first time I've seen so many people kind of raise up their hand and say, I want to get involved. And they felt this. It kind of hit home, even if you weren't from Minneapolis. And so we actually ended up having way more volunteers than Black businesses that were impacted. So that, that was something that was pretty brand new, at least for me. Again, not an activist, but just kind of seeing on the scene. I've never seen so many bodies ready and willing to help like that. So it did feel like a tide was changing. So on the short term, I think there's a lot of things that we can kind of do. I think the bigger battle is the long term and changing how we think, how we operate, and just kind of being open to these new ideas. And because to be quite honest, I think the world that we all kind of envision, right, is something that I don't think America has, for sure America has never seen before. And so to get there is going to be a lot of pulling teeth and a lot of progress. But this is what we got signed up for. So
Yeah, definitely. And off the back of that, of what we can do, what teeth to pull, and how to impact change, I wanted to direct the next question to Sabri and just ask him. I understand you're in your studying of law, you're also a part of a club where you're helping to impact as many people as you can. So I was just wondering if you could, on your level, show us how you're trying to implement change.
Yeah. Well, before I speak about that, I also do want to say that I myself, I'm still learning. I'm still educating myself and growing. And just because I'm Black or we're Black doesn't mean we understand to the full extent a lot of the injustices that people in our community face. But like Maher just touched upon, because we are blessed and have the opportunity to get this education and these resources and whatnot, it is important that we try our best to impact that change. For me personally, so I'm part of an organization where essentially we represent low-income individuals from these minority communities, Black, Hispanic, and whatnot, in court hearings, as I touched upon earlier, for free. As I touched upon earlier, a huge problem with the criminal justice and legal system is that, again, people from these minority communities simply don't have the resources to access, good lawyers or representation or whatnot. And because of that, they're funneled to jail. They're funneled for nonviolent drug crimes to prison for years. There's a plethora of examples out there of how a Black youth will go to jail for 35 years for simply having drugs that if a white youth had, he would have like 10 hours of community service. So again, we're giving them the representation and voice they need in court hearings so that for free, so that concern of lack of resources and legal help is alleviated. But more important than legal help, I think what I really like about the organization is that we're just giving these individuals a friend. Oftentimes people, and again, in these communities, single parent households and whatnot, don't really have someone to turn to for help. Don't really have someone to turn to where they can share their problems because they're trying to deal with them for their kids and whatnot. And I think just being there to listen, to learn, to observe, and give as much help as we can, not only legally, but just on a personal level, goes a long way for these family individuals, because legal problem is one part of the systemic issue, but there's a lot more going out there than just, giving them someone to listen to speak for them in court. So, it's a good organization. I'm happy to be a part of it. And I think just one of the few ways that we can all work to help people from who are Black and minorities and whatnot.
Definitely. And so in closing, we have one last question. So this is more of a personal question for you and your day-to-day lives, but this movement, this struggle, or even just day-to-day life can be emotionally taxing from time to time. So in your field, how do you deal with it? Or in your everyday life? So for me personally, I've put a heavy cap on how much social media I'm consuming. just because it can be hard to watch. Even every time I saw a photo of George Floyd, it's jarring. So just on an emotional level for everyone in the call, how do you personally deal with it, and what kind of advice do you have, if anybody has any they'd like to add?
I can say a few words. So you know, when I went back to Minneapolis, I'm in LA now, but I went back to Minneapolis for Eid, and then which you know it was Saturday, and then the whole George Floyd thing happened on Monday. You know, mentally I was not prepared for that week, and it was a very exhausting week. You know, protesting throughout the day, trying to clean up some of the mess, and um, that was the first time I think it was just so labor intensive for one day where we were just, you know, boots on the ground. But kind of going from that, you know, I think for the most of us, I think we saw our kind of social media feeds change up to a lot of Black Lives Matter content. And just generally, I think our conversations the last couple of weeks have been just around that. And it can be very exhausting. I know for me, I needed to take some, especially after the first initial days, I needed to take some time off and just think about something else, look at something else, and you know, played basketball. You know, just did some, you know, just did something else completely unrelated. And sometimes I think we don't give ourselves that room, or we kind of feel this the shame or guilt of being able to turn off. Meanwhile, you know, we do have to understand that you know, someone like me that now lives in the suburbs, I can turn off and you know, focus on something else. There's no sirens, there's no buildings on fire. But some people, unfortunately, that live where the protests were happening, or you know, other various areas of the city, don't have that privilege to just kind of disconnect for a second and kind of recoup mentally. But you know, if you have that privilege, you definitely use it. Don't feel ashamed to, and we need to kind of recharge to be able to go back out there and do what needs to be done. So definitely take the time and space that you need.
Um, yeah, I would echo a lot of what Maher said. I think, like in my job, pretty much every day I am working on cases of police brutality, of another case of a Black person being killed by police. We have thousands of people reaching out to us asking for help in specific cases that I'm reading about, with pictures in these emails. So definitely seeing like a lot of really painful things to see. Part of what keeps me grounded is spending time with family and friends, and just constantly reminding myself that the work is important and that we can do something to help. Like feeling like you have some sense of agency, that you can change things, is something that helps me like stay focused and encouraged in the work.
Yeah, I can say a few words. Sorry, Kauthar. I think before I talk about what I do personally, like Maher said, it's a blessing in itself that we were able to quote unquote turn off ourselves from, you know, these issues. Like we can just not go on Instagram for a day, or not, you know, go on follow the media or whatever platform you use. And you know, there are people in our country and in our cities who deal with these issues every day. They can't turn it off, you know. So I think it's always important to be cognizant of that. But for me personally, I just try to avoid like mainstream media as much as possible, because I think a lot of the racial inequality in this country, a lot of it comes from the media. Just quick examples. You probably noticed that, you know, peaceful protests continued long after the media stopped covering them, but they stopped covering them because people weren't, you know, looting or violently rioting or whatnot, but because, you know, but the media didn't want to actually pay attention to the message behind the protests, even when they went on peacefully after that period of looting was done. You know, I think as Kota said earlier, this coronavirus pandemic has disproportionately affected minority communities to a crazy amount. But you'll never hear CNN, MSNBC, or whatever media outlet you get your news from touch upon that. So for me, I try, of course, to stay engaged and aware and active and try to find what's going on through my own means. But I think sensationalist media and social media to an extent is one way that can really, drain you and harm your mentality. But at the same time, it's important to stay educated, active, and aware. Because like I said, just because you can turn off your issues, the issues, doesn't mean you should. And especially because we have the blessing, it's important to always stay, active, engaged, and so forth.
I think for myself, I'm definitely like a people person. And in like challenging times, it's always helpful for me to be in community with other people. But we're having this conversation in the middle of a global pandemic, so it's like you can't just go and hang out with your friends or find a breather kind of in that space that we used to be able to do. So I think that's what's made staying away from social media so challenging for me right now, because it's the place where you're connecting with people, but it's also the place where you're getting like real-time updates of what's happening, and it's very difficult to kind of balance that. So I'm still navigating that, to be honest. But I think in terms of kind of being able to take a break, and then also knowing like the community we're talking to right now. My grandmother reminded me, my protector, she said, it's so important in moments like this when it feels like there's so much despair and uncertainty to remember that you can always turn to, your creator. And I feel like there's so much power in just, making dua and praying, that is very difficult for me to find in another space to the same degree. So I think you can't underscore that enough.
Definitely. Yeah, and that these are all such great pieces of advice. And so I know we'd set aside time for a Q&A. So we haven't received any questions. We have a lot of people watching, but no one's really sent any questions. So I'll give a few moments for people to add in questions. If you'd like, just put them in the section down in Facebook. I'll be waiting on them. But just in case we don't receive any, I'm gonna give a small reminder for us as immigrants of Eritreans and as a Muslim community too. A few months ago, I was blessed with the opportunity to hear a lecture about the Black Muslim movement and how that developed here in America. And what that entailed was throughout the 1900s, there was a small shift as Jim Crow was happening and people wanted to come together. So in New York, there's a community of Muslims, and if you wanted to read more on it, there's a professor, Dr. Rasul Miller, and he writes on a website called Sapelo Square. So if anybody wants to read up on this, but pretty much what happened was there was a movement of Black Muslim people in New York that were trying to come together to fight for freedom, to just be able to live in this country as wholly as humans as possible. And what really shocked me as I was listening to the lecture was at the same time that I was listening to him, and he's giving these dates that in the 1940s, there was a Muslim community here of Black Muslims fighting for liberation, fighting for the ability to be wholly themselves in this nation. I was reading a book by Dr. Joseph Venosa, Paths Towards the Nation. And this details the history of Eritrea in 1941 through 1961. And I just remember hearing the dates that he's telling of these people fighting for liberation and the ability to be wholly human, and matching those dates with the dates I'm hearing in these books of our ancestors who were trying to find that same level of liberation for themselves. And I remember reading, the thing that struck me the most was there was a delegation of Eritreans who were ready to go to the United Nations, and Abdul Qadir Kabir, Allah Yarhamu, was assassinated right before they went. And I looked at the date, and it was in the 50s, and it was almost one of the exact same dates that the gentleman was mentioning. And it made me realize that as Eritreans, Muslim, Christian, whatever it may be, our struggle and the struggle here of the African American are one and the same. They're a struggle for justice, for equality, for the ability to live a life unimpeded. So we definitely all need to make note of that. And I think a big thing would be to educate ourselves and to educate our community members that when we're here in America, this isn't just our struggle. We have our brothers and sisters in the African American community, whether they be Muslim or not, that we have to work with, as they are suffering from the same things that we're suffering from. So we have one question here. I hope I didn't like stand on my soapbox for too long there, guys. But I think we can two questions that we can end it on. So the first question is, what's been your biggest revelation or learning during this current uprising? So if anybody would like to answer that.
I guess more of a revelation, but this time does feel different. Like protests like these have happened after a lot of really high profile cases of police misconduct and killing, but this is a sustained effort, and there is promise in that change is actually happening now. I think it's important that we always keep in mind, though, that these things tend to fade away from the public view. So in order to keep the push for change happening, people need to get involved. And by people, I mean everyone, including all of us, get involved in actually working on that change. Akram, I think that you are absolutely right that making sure that we're educated about these issues is important, but you shouldn't feel like that should ever be a barrier. You don't have to be a policy expert to get involved. You don't have to know everything that there is to know about the legal system or about policing or about economic racism or environmental racism. You don't need to have like the highest level of knowledge to engage in these issues. You just need to start getting engaged. A lot of it is stuff that you learn on the job, and a lot of stuff you learn by actually doing the work. So I think now is the time that people should start actually getting involved in the work, find local groups to get involved in.
Just to kind of add to that a little bit, I think what surprised me throughout this whole ordeal was, or the last couple of weeks, was how much I didn't know, especially about Black literature. I mean, just kind of these type of conversations have been had, I think multiple cycles throughout the last 60, 70 years. So um, I think I kind of knew that, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, for the first time, but I did not know how much I did not know. And I think just kind of reading, because I'm kind of going back to kind of what I think is the initial step to the solution is kind of changing the public mind. You can't do that without new information, without just kind of reading and having dialogue with people. And so that was kind of my biggest thing, takeaway from this whole George Floyd protest, was talking to people, learning from them, and then just being able to just tell as many people as I can, just kind of share readings and just talk to people, and then they go ahead and share that, and then what folks have told me, I kind of did the same with. So just having just that kind of exchange of information, either through social media or in person, was very enlightening, to say the least. So.
And then no one else has a revelation. Last question to end us off for the day was, what can we advise families to do regarding these issues?
Education, I think, has been one of the themes that's been prevalent throughout this discussion, and it's just, whether it's your parents, your brothers, your sisters, whoever it may be, is just educate, learn. Like Adam said, education should not be a barrier to getting involved. But of course, I do think it is kind of one of the prerequisites, is that you know what you're talking about, what issues to delve into, and how you can get involved. And I think this time also feels different because, I mean, at least for me personally, I've had like non-Black or non-POC people I know reach out and just send a text saying, hey, I hear you, hey, these issues. And, I think in a weird way, this pandemic, forced people to be home, has finally made them realize and educate and research a little bit more about what's going on. But we shouldn't, like Adam said, let that fade away, right? I think while we're educating ourselves, it's important to educate people around you, especially non-Black and non-POC people about these issues. And you don't have to be a preacher or a teacher professor to do that. It's simply reading books. It's simply going online. The internet's a really powerful tool these days. So using all the resources out there, and because again, we're blessed to have the education and ability to learn and grow in this country, we should also use that as a tool to make sure people who look like us don't face injustice. Injustice to one person who looks like us is injustice to all of us. And I think it's important to be cognizant of that as we move forward.
Just to add to that, I think we had a lot of discussion today about how almost all these systems are targeting Black folks, and I think as Eritreans we kind of see it as something that's kind of out there and something that doesn't really affect us day to day. But I think I would, not to kind of get alarmist, but I think I would almost encourage everyone to, as you engage with all these different systems, whether it be education, healthcare, banking, so on and so forth, you're almost, be almost paranoid. For one, for example, Black women, engaging with our healthcare system, it's very easy to say this now, and it's very difficult in practice, but make sure your doctor hears you. Make sure you try to find doctors of color. Make sure you ask around for resources. And when you do find something like that, share it with the rest of the community. Same thing with banking. Make sure why is your interest rate the way it is? Is it, especially for a home mortgage, and make sure that you're asking around and you're getting a reasonable rate, and all these things. So I mean, in every one of these different systems, try to be almost paranoid and say, is this engagement fair? Is this reasonable? Because sometimes, we don't even know that we're being discriminated against. It almost feels normal, and we need to make sure we kind of check that ourselves first, and then try to do as much as we can. But I think most, if there is one takeaway, if we do find one leg up, if we do find just one resource or one way to kind of combat all these kind of discriminatory practices against the community, share that with the rest of the community, so yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, I would echo what Sabri was saying about education. It's not your responsibility to teach every single white person why systemic racism is an issue. That's not your job, right? And if you decide to take on that labor, that's amazing. Good for you, and more power to you. But I think it is our responsibility to be having these conversations with our communities. And though they're the most challenging conversations, it's the space where I think we have the most ability to make a difference. So when you're at a community event, and there might be an uncle that says something that's kind of problematic, it's your responsibility to have a conversation with them about why that's the case. And even though that might be a little bit tiring, or maybe that might be maybe it takes a little bit more effort to explain why it's not right to perpetuate kind of these issues. I think it's our responsibility to do that, because just as much as we are also dealing with systematic anti-Blackness, there are also ways that we can also be perpetuating those issues. And I think it's really important to have open dialogue, open conversation within our community about that, in addition to doing the homework. And I'm looking forward to the resource that we're going to be putting together following this conversation, that hopefully can help prompt those conversations.
One last thing I really do want to double down on the emphasis on how we actually change this in a significant way. And I think it does come down to direct action in a lot of ways. I completely agree with everyone here that having these conversations is incredibly important. Engaging in conversations and education is incredibly important. But just talking will never be enough. And I think that we should constantly be looking for ways how to get directly involved in changing the systems of government. We shouldn't feel like we don't have a place in doing that. And we shouldn't feel like you need to have a certain level of education or anything to get involved in that. Direct action is how we've seen change occur in the past. And I think as much as possible, especially at this really critical time where there's the momentum, we should be engaging in direct action.
Definitely. Education and action, action and education, two huge things to keep in mind. So just to conclude, like Kothar mentioned, we will be collecting a list of different books, movies, shows, whatever it may be, and putting together a resource list so that if anyone wanted ideas as to what to educate yourself with, or what to learn from, or what actions to take, we will be sharing that in the coming days. So be on the lookout for that. But just to end the conversation, I just want to say thank you to all of the speakers for taking time out of your Sundays to come and speak. And all of you have your own specific fields and your own things that you're working in. So having your perspectives is really valued. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you, Kothar. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Maher. And thank you, Sabri. Hopefully that this can bring change, or this can be the catalyst in one person's mind at the least to help them understand, because I know it definitely was for me. So thank you all. And I believe that should conclude it all. So, Assalamu alaikum, everybody.